Bible to the present. Let's go back to the Roman period. We're not going to see a lot of Roman ruins in the land of Israel. There were a lot, but we won't see very much. We will see some. The Romans, as I said, took over in 63 BC, and they were responsible for Israel on up into the time of the modern period, into 300, 400 AD. But a significant event occurs in the year 70 AD. Can anybody tell me what that was? The destruction of the temple. So, the temple was built by Solomon, and it was destroyed by the Babylonians. When the Jews came back from exile, they rebuilt the temple. It was a small thing. It wasn't very big at all. In fact, anybody that had seen the old temple, when they saw the new one, they really felt bad. But that was the temple, that's the second temple. You remember I told you about Herod the Great? Herod the Great was a builder. This guy loved to build stuff, and the more magnificent stuff he built, the better he felt about himself. Well, one of the things he decided to do, and it wasn't for religious reasons, it was for political reasons, is he renovated this second temple. Remember I told you it was a puny little thing? By the time Herod the Great gets done with it, this is a monumental thing. This is a magnificent thing. The platform on which he builds the temple is 27 football fields in size. Huge! And the temple that he builds is glorious. But actually, it's a remodel. It's a fixer-upper. It's still the second temple. We'll talk more about that when we get there. He no sooner gets finished building this temple. In fact, it was continuing even after his death. And it's just completed a short period of time before the Jews get rebellious and the Romans get angry. And the end result is that temple is destroyed in 70 AD. Leveled. I mean leveled. No more temple. There have only been two temples. The one that Solomon built, the one that the returning Jews built, and that Herod renovated. That's it. Now, there are some people who believe there'll be a third temple. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. 70 AD, so a crushing defeat by the Jews. But the Jews were still permitted to live in the land. They were still permitted to live in Jerusalem. But there was a seething resentment. It had always been. But when they lost their temple, there was a seething resentment on the part of the Jews against the Romans, who were now their captors. And there was a second Jewish revolt. It occurred about 50 or 60 years after the one that cost them the temple. The second Jewish revolt was as successful. It was a devastating defeat. And at that point, the Romans said, all right, all Jews out of Jerusalem. It was illegal for the Jews to actually live in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was rebuilt as a Roman city, name changed and everything. The emperor called it Aelia Capitolina. Redesigned it. In fact, we're going to see evidence of the redesign of the Roman street plan in those of us who are going. The Romans controlled with an iron grip. What happened to the Jews? Well, they had to leave Jerusalem. They no longer had a temple, which means the fundamental part of their religion is changed. One of the things that you'll notice about the Jews is an incredible resilience. As a people, they are incredibly resilient. They said, well, if we don't have a temple and we can't live in Jerusalem, then we'll move to some place where we can live in peace and we'll continue our religion. And so they moved to the coast, to the town of Tiberias, which we're going to visit, and that became one of the centers of what we know as rabbinic Judaism. Do you hear the word rabbi in there? It became a religion of a book, the law of Moses. So they no longer had sacrifices, no longer had a temple, but they still had the religion of the book. And this is where a lot of these religious rules were developed and written down. So Judaism continues. They still live in the land, especially over there in Tiberias and a few other places. Something happens in the 4th century that is quite remarkable. The emperor converts to Christianity. Now, you remember, for many years, Christians had to fear for their lives. They were killed, they were martyred for their faith. But the Emperor Constantine becomes a Christian. And as a part of becoming a Christian, Christianity is now a permitted religion and eventually becomes the favored religion. After all, if that's the religion of the emperor and you want favor with the emperor, it's a good idea. Become a Christian. So Christianity completely changes in its status during this 4th century period under the Romans. Now, this is significant for a couple of reasons. One is, not only does Constantine become Christian, his mother becomes a Christian, and his mother decides to take a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. I'll come back to that in a minute. Constantine does something else. He actually moves the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome to what the city we now know as Istanbul. It was Constantinople as he rebuilt it. So the whole Roman Empire shifts to Constantinople and becomes known as the Byzantine Empire. It's still Roman. It's just the Eastern Roman Empire. Rome had expanded and the capital moves to a more central place. So it's still the Roman Empire, but it has a more of an Eastern flavor to it. Now, you remember I told you about Constantine's wife, her mom. Her name was Helen. And Helena becomes a pilgrim, and she goes to visit sites in Israel. And where she goes with her entourage, she and others identify certain sites as being holy sites. And because these are holy sites that are associated with Christianity, churches are built. And so during the Byzantine time, you have this flourishing of churches that are being built by the Byzantines to celebrate some event in the life of Christ. Now, I thought it might be interesting to show you a bit of the Byzantine style, because we will see some Byzantine ruins. We'll see a few ruins from the biblical period, some ruins from the Roman period. We're going to see more ruins from the Byzantine period. Here are a couple of features that I want to point out. Notice the mosaic. Byzantines were really good, and they really loved to create art, pictures, using these tiny stones, colored stones. They're known as tesserae. And they would be arranged in a certain pattern, like here you see the loaves and the fishes. We'll see this mosaic from the Byzantine period when we're visiting in Galilee at the Church of Tavga. The other architectural feature is this construction. It's actually from the Crusader period, but it's built on the same pattern, the same design as a Byzantine church. This is on the Mount of Ascension. Originally, there was no roof on that church, but the Byzantines, because it was Ascension, so Christ ascending, don't put a roof on it, but the Byzantines loved to build buildings in an octagonal shape. It's a favorite style of theirs. And they loved to put domes on their buildings. They were great at it, incredible at it. So those are two features that you're going to see. When you see these features, it's at least a reason to think it might be Byzantine. Other later architectural styles borrowed from them. The Byzantines ruled this area from the 4th to the 7th century until the Muslims took it over. I'd mentioned Muhammad before. The Muslims conquered Jerusalem in 638 AD, and they built their own style. This is the Dome of the Rock. Now, I want you to notice several things. What shape is it? Octagonal. You notice the dome? So one of the features of Islamic architecture is the borrowing of the domes. You'll see lots of those. You'll also see that the Muslims, at least in this instance, chose to keep the octagonal shape. I'll talk more about that later. The other feature, and I hope you can see it, can you see the tile work all around the outside and the incredible calligraphy on the tile work? It's in the Arabic script. These are features of the Islamic architecture that we're going to see. And we're going to see lots of examples of this, shrines and mosques that were built by the Muslims. Christians became very upset that the Holy Land was occupied by the infidels, the Muslims. And so Christianity created what are known as crusades, and the Pope authorized, everybody was Roman Catholic at the time, essentially, the Pope authorized these crusades, which were basically a holy war against the Muslims who occupied the Holy Land, and it was considered a virtue to fight and kill on behalf of recovering these sites. So the first Crusades begin in the year 1099, and so this we call the Crusader period. It was about 200 years that the Crusaders conquered the Holy Land and maintained the Holy Land, actually established what's known as the Latin Kingdom in the Holy Land. It lasted for 200 years. Characteristic of Crusader architecture are forts. They built lots of forts for obvious reasons. Their style is much bigger, bulkier. You see the arches, the pointed arches. That's a feature of the Crusader. This is what traditionally is known as the upper room, where the church gathered for the day of Pentecost. I don't know that it actually was, but that's the traditional site of it. And on this side, this is the Church of St. Anne, which is a Crusader construction built near the pools of Bethesda. It has the most beautiful acoustics. In fact, when we go there, we may have an opportunity to sing together. Just incredible acoustics. If we don't get a chance, we'll at least hear some other tourists singing. As I mentioned, the Crusaders lasted for a couple of hundred years, and then they were defeated. And that brings us to another long period of Muslim rule until the year 1517, when a particular group of Muslims from Turkey take over this whole land. We call this the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire took over this territory and ruled it for a good 400 years. And it was during this time period that the walls that we're going to see around Jerusalem are built. They're built by a man by the name of Suleiman the Magnificent. And he builds these walls, and we'll talk more about them later. Anybody know whose side the Turks fought on in the First World War? The losing side. In consequence of losing the First World War, the Turks had to forfeit their control of this land. And it passed to the control of the British. And so this is the period at which the British become in charge of the Holy Land. Now, during this time period, they tried to accommodate the various populations, obviously very difficult. The Jews now saw themselves as having an opportunity to emigrate from wherever they were, especially from Europe. They saw the opportunity now that their Holy Land, their land, was in the control of the British. They saw their opportunity to emigrate back to the Holy Land, and people were encouraging them to do that. We call this Zionism. You heard that name before? Zionism. This is the movement to encourage Jews to return to Israel and resettle in Israel. And they saw their opportunity now that the Brits were in control. Well, obviously, the Holy Land is already occupied by people. And the Arabs who were living in their homes and had been living in these homes for hundreds and hundreds of years don't take kindly to the fact that all of a sudden these Jews are emigrating to their country and calling it their country. So there's a lot of friction, created all kinds of problems for the British. Partly through the British, partly because of the Second World War, the United Nations in the year 1947 determined that Israel should be given the right to govern itself in this land and gave permission to the Jews to establish their own nation. This is 1947. It's the United Nations decision. Of course, the plan was accepted by the Jews and rejected by the Arabs. And that's where it sat for about a year. Britain saw there was no hope of any kind of reconciliation. They stepped out. In 1948, the Jews, with the authorization of the United Nations, established the State of Israel. And war broke out. As soon as the Jews established the nation of Israel, the Arabs all around them determined that that was not going to happen. And immediately, several nations joined together and attacked this tiny little nascent population. And the Jews won. That was 1949. When the ceasefire happened, it left Israel in control of almost all that territory. During this time, they kicked out Palestinians from homes and territories and villages that they had been in some cases for hundreds of years. And if you talk to a Palestinian today, you will immediately see the anger and frustration of what happened 80 years ago. They have a name for it. They call it al-Nakba, the catastrophe. There's no way that you and I can understand what's going on in that region unless we have some sense of al-Nakba, of what it meant to be forced to leave your land with no compensation. Created all kinds of refugees. I mentioned that in 1949, Israel controlled most of the land, not all of the land. Here's a political map of Israel. In 1949, you notice the large territory known as the West Bank. It's called the West Bank because it's on the west bank of the Jordan. In 1949, that was controlled by the country of Jordan, which is to the east of the Jordan River. Egypt controlled Gaza. So down below here is where Egypt is, and so Egypt controlled Gaza. So in 1949, Jordan controlled the West Bank, and Egypt controlled Gaza. Another war occurred in 1967, the Yom Kippur War. Israel was attacked on its holiest day of the year, the day of Yom Kippur, Day of Atonement. Israel won that one. And in that victory, they took control of the West Bank, East Jerusalem. They had already control of the western part of Jerusalem. They took control of the eastern part of Jerusalem. They took the Golan Heights from Syria. They took Gaza. They actually took Sinai, which is on down below where Israel is there. They took all that territory. And in the peace deals that they've had since, they've been in negotiations with Syria to give back the Golan Heights, which I don't think they'll do. They did give back Sinai to the Egyptians. But it's land for peace. The tensions continue. When we were there in 2000, you could have touched it off with a spark. And sure enough, shortly after we left, although I don't think it had anything to do with our visit, shortly after we left began what's known as the Intifada in 2000. And the tensions have been seething ever since. Part of the tension is the fact that Gaza is now controlled by a group of Palestinians known as Hamas, which is an Arabic word that means violence. That movement is not a part of the Palestinian Authority. It actually works at cross purposes with it, and so Israel is all the time concerned about rocket attacks fired from Gaza. Complicating this are Israeli settlements in the West Bank. Now take a good look at the West Bank. All those blue dots are Israel settling Jews in territory which is supposed to be the property of the Palestinians. This is why when you hear about these settlements, it's a real political hot potato. Are you going to support Israeli settlements in the West Bank, or are you going to oppose them? If you support them, then basically you're allowing Israel to encroach in territory that really has been the Palestinian places where they live, and of course that's going to create tension. If you're for the Israeli settlements, then you're going to talk about security and the fact that if we're going to live among the Palestinians, we need to be protected. And so you've heard about the wall, not the one President Trump wants to build on the south border of the United States. This is another wall, and they actually are often compared. But this is a wall that Israel wants to build around the West Bank to protect the Jews from the Palestinians who live in the West Bank. Here's a picture of what that wall looks like. So it is a complicated picture. All kinds of questions, like what do we do with these refugees from the catastrophe? Do we compensate them? Do we let them go back? Now the Jews have been living there for decades. Should we let these Jewish settlements continue in the occupied West Bank? What do we do with Jerusalem? Right now, it's all under the control of Israel, but you and I will notice a sharp distinction between the Arab East Jerusalem and the Israeli West Jerusalem. Should we divide it? Should we create a kind of a neutral zone? Take it out of the hands of both? That's the question that people are wrestling with. Do we create two states? You've heard of the two-state solution? Do we create two states, a Palestinian state, an Israeli state? This is a very complicated issue, and I don't pretend to know the resolution, but you will hear plenty about it when you're there. All right, let's stop here and get some questions, and then finish up with one more topic. Pastor Joel, questions?
I think heads are full of new information.